There are wounds that don't bleed on the skin, but lie deep within the heart, where a father's rejection becomes a lifelong sentence for a child. This is the story of a man who once believed his daughter was a mistake, and the price he paid for treating love like a transaction. 25 years later, that very daughter, now a gifted surgeon, would be the one holding his life in her hands. But she sought neither revenge nor forgiveness. Her silence was the strongest answer of all. A daughter is never a burden, but a force powerful enough to rebuild an entire world. London, on a March afternoon. Thin raindrops, like threads of silk, slid quietly down the glass windows of a luxurious penthouse in Mayfair. Inside, Clara Moreau sat in an emerald velvet armchair, both hands gently resting on her swollen belly. She was only 24, once a promising ballet dancer on the stage of the Royal Opera House. But since marrying Edward Lancaster, a millionaire businessman 10 years her senior, her life had taken a different turn. On the side table, the freshly printed ultrasound images were still warm. Clara carefully lifted them, gazing at the faint yet distinct outline of the child inside her womb. A tiny nose, a delicate hand raised as if to greet the world. Clara smiled, tears spilling uncontrollably. "My daughter, you are wonderful," she whispered in the soft French accent of her Parisian homeland. The mahogany doors of the living room swung open. Edward Lancaster entered, his tall frame wrapped in a charcoal-tailored suit. He was the epitome of London's elite, neatly slicked, back brown hair, a Swiss watch gleaming on his wrist, eyes cold as steel. Yet today, to Clara, that aura of authority felt more unsettling than ever. "Edward," Clara called softly, her voice trembling with joy. "The doctor just confirmed. We're having a little girl." A silence stretched. Edward froze, his gaze falling on the ultrasound photos in his wife's hands. When he finally spoke, his voice was rigid, metallic. "A girl?" Clara nodded, smiling faintly. "Yes, our daughter. The doctor says she's perfectly healthy. Look, these tiny little hands." "For God's sake," Edward cut her off, his tone dripping with contempt. "Clara, do you realize what you've done? You've ruined everything." The images slipped from Clara's hands, scattering across the Persian rug. She stared at her husband in shock, her heart tightening. "I don't understand. She's the embodiment of our love. How can you—" "Don't use the word love with me," Edward snapped. "You know exactly what sustains the Lancaster name. My father built this empire for his son. My grandfather passed it to his son. The shareholders, the board, all expect me to produce a male heir. A daughter cannot be a Lancaster. She's nothing but an ornament, a frivolous expense for the family until she takes her husband's name and disappears." Each word pierced Clara's heart like a dagger. She staggered, clutching the armrest for support. Memories rushed back. Edward kneeling to propose in the middle of the Royal Opera House after Swan Lake. The promises he made to build a beautiful world where love and family were everything. She had believed him, and now their child was dismissed as a mistake. "Oh, Edward, please," Clara pleaded, struggling to steady her voice. "She's our flesh and blood. A girl can be just as intelligent, strong, and capable of carrying on a legacy as anyone else. She is a gift, not a burden." Edward let out a sharp, humorless laugh that echoed through the vast room. "A girl running the Lancaster Group? Absurd. Don't let your artistic delusions blind you. Sons carry legacies. Daughters dance around just like their mothers." The words struck Clara like a direct blow. Once proud of her ballet career, she now heard it reduced to a meaningless pastime. Hot tears streamed down her face. Adjusting his tie, Edward glanced at the mirror on the wall, as though the conversation had nothing to do with him. "I'm going out. Albion Club tonight. Perhaps Charles and Victoria can help me navigate this situation." He lingered mockingly on the word situation, as though their unborn daughter were nothing more than a market crisis. Clara no longer had the strength to stop him. The door closed, leaving the young woman alone in the cold opulence of the penthouse. She collapsed into the chair, trembling hands clutching her belly. The baby kicked softly, as if to comfort her. Clara choked back tears, whispering, "Don't be afraid, Amelia. No matter what your father says, you are my miracle. I will protect you." Outside, the rain fell heavier, as if mourning with her tears. While Clara wrestled with her grief, on the other side of London, Edward Lancaster stepped into the Albion Club, a sanctuary of the upper class. Warm, wood-panelled walls, leather chairs, golden lamps exuded refinement. But to him, it was a battlefield, where the Lancaster legacy and honour had to be defended at all costs. Victoria Harrow, a sharp-eyed businesswoman, raised her martini as she spotted him. "Edward, just in time. We were debating whether wind power can truly replace oil. But you look unsettled?" Edward gripped the chair tightly, his voice edged with frustration. "Clara is pregnant with a girl." A brief silence. Charles Blackwell set down his whiskey, brow furrowing. Beatrice Sterling let out a derisive laugh, her voice dripping scorn. "A daughter? My Lancaster, what a disaster." Victoria tilted her head, her crimson lips curling into a cold smile. "Unfortunate, but you still have time. Let her be born, then find another way. Men like you aren't short of options." Edward narrowed his eyes. "What do you mean?" "Simple," Charles interjected. "There are organizations that arrange discreet adoptions for the upper class. They know how to handle such matters quietly. You still have the chance for a proper heir." Beatrice shrugged, her shrill voice cutting in. "Or just pretend the child doesn't exist. Don't acknowledge her. Let someone else raise her. Neat, clean." "I?" The word seeped into Edward's ears like poisoned honey. A dark seed sprouted in his mind. To deny his daughter, to act as though she had never belonged to him. He leaned back, eyes distant, murmuring, "Perhaps that's the solution." At home, Clara kissed the ultrasound photos, vowing to shield her child. But at the Albion Club, her baby girl's fate was being dismissed as a mistake to be erased. That night, when Edward returned to the penthouse, Clara had fallen asleep on the sofa, arms wrapped protectively around her belly. Ultrasound photos lay scattered on the table. He paused, his gaze landing on the tiny face imprinted faintly on the paper. For a fleeting moment, his heart clenched, perhaps a fragile spark of fatherly instinct. But then Victoria's, Charles's, and Beatrice's voices echoed in his head. "A daughter is nothing but a burden." Edward gathered the photos and tossed them into the fireplace. Flames roared, devouring the innocent smile of the child who had not yet taken her first breath. "I have no daughter," he whispered to the fire. Beyond the window, the storm raged harder, as though trying to wash away the stain of his guilt. The next morning, pale sunlight filtered through London's thick fog, casting a muted glow over the imposing facade of the Albion Club. This was not merely a private gentleman's club, but a fortress of power, where financial decisions could shake the entire European market. The faces that gathered here belonged to the highest echelons of society: politicians, tycoons, and the ultra-wealthy who treated laws as little more than toys. In the main lounge, Edward Lancaster sank into a black leather chair by the great fireplace. A glass of whiskey swirled in his hand, though his mind churned with unrest. Last night, after throwing the ultrasound photos into the fire, he still couldn't shake a gnawing unease. Through the haze of liquor and flames, the image of that tiny girl seemed to hover before him, mocking him. The door swung open. Charles Blackwell, a towering man with salt and pepper hair and hawk-like eyes, strode in. He had been Edward's closest ally since the early days of building Lancaster Group, and was infamous for betraying anyone, if it meant gaining an edge. "Edward," Charles clapped a heavy hand on his shoulder, his smile wide but cold. "Last night you looked like a man who'd just lost his fortune. So, tell me, how's that disaster coming along?" Edward clenched his jaw. "A girl. Clara's carrying a girl." Charles let out a whistle and pulled up a chair. "That's troublesome indeed. But don't worry, there are ways to handle it." Before he could continue, Victoria Harrow arrived, draped in a fur coat, lips painted a deep crimson. Her eyes were as merciless as scalpels that stripped away every secret. Behind her trailed Beatrice Sterling, a socialite whose shrill voice and meddlesome nature turned other people's misfortunes into her favorite pastime. Victoria raised her martini. "Edward, I heard from Charles. My condolences. A girl can never be a Lancaster. The shareholders will never accept it. Beatrice sneered. Exactly. I've seen noble families collapse for lack of a male heir. You can't let Lancaster Group fall into the hands of some little doll. Edward slammed his glass down, his voice a growl. Don't call my child a doll. The three fell silent, exchanging glances of surprise and disdain. Charles finally spoke, his tone deliberate. If you still consider it your child, but Edward, you must choose, legacy or sentiment. The air grew heavy. The old portraits on the walls, earls and barons long gone, seemed to glare down, passing silent judgment. Victoria crossed her legs, her voice like ice. Be realistic. We all know the unwritten rule. Sons preserve dynasties, daughters marry out. If this child lives, she'll bear another man's name, live in another man's estate, and what will remain of Lancaster? Edward said nothing. He recalled the boardroom meetings, the aging shareholders chanting the same refrain. Our legacy is masculinity, strength, power. Since childhood, his father had told him, there is no room for weakness in the Lancasters. Beatrice clicked her tongue, voice dripping with scorn. You're still young. Clara can have more children. Think of this baby as a stepping stone. Charles leaned in. Or you could arrange for the child to disappear. There are organizations for this, discreet, efficient, leaving no trace. The baby would grow up elsewhere, with no ties to Lancaster. Clean. Edward's eyes narrowed, his voice sharp as glass. You're advising me to deny my own blood. Charles shrugged, utterly indifferent. We're not talking about blood. We're talking about the company, the legacy. An empire cannot gamble on a girl. Remember, Edward, everything you've built will collapse the moment shareholders smell weakness. Well, Victoria's smile was razor thin. Don't think like a father, think like a strategist. To protect a throne, sometimes one must sacrifice pawns. The words struck Edward like a hammer. He raised his glass, draining it, letting the fire of whiskey burn away whatever emotions lingered. Meanwhile, at home, Clara stood alone in the nursery she had begun to prepare. Pastel paintings of angels on the wall, a small wooden crib in the center, fairy tale books neatly stacked on the table. Every detail breathed love and hope. She laid her hand gently on her belly. Amelia kicked lightly, as if responding. Clara smiled through her tears. My love, I don't need castles. I don't need power. All I want is for you to grow up safe, knowing you are loved. That is enough. But in that tender moment, she had no idea that at the Albion Club, her daughter's fate was being discussed like a business transaction. Back at the club, the conversation pressed on. Beatrice folded her arms, eyes gleaming with curiosity. Edward, have you told Clara yet? No, she still believes I'll love the child, no matter the gender. Edward gave a cold, mirthless laugh. She's still so naive. Charles nodded firmly. Don't let sentiment cloud your judgment. I've seen powerful men brought down because they grew soft for women. You cannot afford that mistake. Victoria leaned forward, her voice sharp as a blade. Decide, Edward. Either accept the shareholders tearing Lancaster Group to shreds, or cut out the tumor now. In that instant, Edward felt as though he was seated before a vast chessboard. Clara and the baby were fragile pawns. He could choose to protect them, but at the cost of his empire, or he could sacrifice them to preserve his throne. He drew a long breath. You're right. I won't let a daughter destroy Lancaster Group. Charles lifted his glass, smiling in satisfaction. That's the Edward Lancaster I know. Victoria's lips curved slightly. Good. I'll make some calls. I know people who can make a child vanish into a permanent secret. Beatrice burst out laughing, her shrill voice echoing against the paneled walls. Oh, delicious. A family scandal handled like a financial deal. Edward, you really do know how to play. That night, when Edward returned to the penthouse, Clara had prepared a simple dinner, roasted salmon and pumpkin soup dishes the doctor recommended for pregnancy. But Edward didn't so much as glance at them. He sat down, opened his laptop, and began typing furiously, the screen's glow reflecting his frozen face. Clara asked timidly, Are you busy again? I wanted to show you the nursery. I added some decorations. Don't bother me, Clara. He cut her off, eyes never leaving the screen. I'm handling a situation. She fell silent, the vast kitchen suddenly icy cold. A vague, gnawing unease crept into her heart. There was something different in Edward's eyes now, something dark she had never seen before. At 2 in the morning, Clara awoke, thirsty. Passing by the study, she saw the light still on. The door was ajar, revealing Edward at his desk, surrounded by papers. She stepped closer, and her heart stopped when she read the bold title. Termination of Parental Rights. Adoption Papers. The documents were neatly stacked, accompanied by business cards from adoption agencies. Clara froze, clutching the doorframe with trembling hands. Edward looked up, his cold eyes locking with her despairing gaze. "Edward, what is this?" He shut the laptop with a snap, his tone detached, as though discussing a business deal. Contingency planning. "Clara, you need to learn to think like a businesswoman, not an artist." She shook her head, tears spilling down her cheeks. "What are you planning to do with our daughter? Give her away? She hasn't even been born, and you've already abandoned her." "Don't say our," Edward replied icily. "That child will never be a Lancaster." Clara felt her world collapse. But deep inside, a flame flickered to life, the flame of a mother ready to fight, even if it meant defying the entire world. London lay shrouded in grey mist, the street lamps along Park Lane casting a dim golden glow onto the rain-soaked pavement. Inside the luxurious penthouse, Clara Moreau stood frozen in her husband's study. Before her lay stacks of cold documents, termination of parental rights, private adoption services, arranged neatly like a death sentence for the child who had yet to be born. Edward Lancaster sat behind the desk, the lamplight carving his face into stone. He showed no attempt to hide, no trace of remorse. What are you doing?" Clara's voice trembled. One hand cradled her belly, the other gripped the doorframe as though to keep from collapsing. Edward looked up, his voice calm yet merciless. "Contingency planning. A Lancaster cannot place his legacy in the hands of a daughter. I've prepared everything. All you need to do is sign." He pushed the thick folder toward her, the top page bearing the words, "Relinquishment of Maternal Rights." Clara staggered back, eyes wide, lips quivering but no sound escaping. At last, her voice broke. "You're insane. She's our daughter, our flesh and blood. How can you—" Edward cut her off, his gaze sharp as a blade. "Yours, not mine. I told you I have no daughter." The declaration sliced through her heart. Clara collapsed into a chair, clutching her stomach. In that moment, the baby kicked softly, as if to protest the cruel fate awaiting her. Clara wept, her tears smudging the cold, printed words on the page. The days that followed became a relentless nightmare. Edward summoned a new interior designer and ordered the nursery redone. Clara stood paralyzed as the woman with bleached blonde hair and a fixed, plastic smile chirped. "Mr. Lancaster asked me to prepare the room for a little boy. I think navy blue tones with dark wood furniture would be perfect for a future CEO." Clara gasped. "A boy?" "No. It's—" Edward interrupted smoothly, his tone firm. "I said design for the Lancaster heir. Gender is irrelevant. Consider it a minor detail." A minor detail. To him, his daughter's existence was nothing more than a flaw in his plan. Clara clenched her fists, forcing back tears in front of the stranger. Only after the designer left did she whirl on her husband, screaming in despair. "You're erasing her existence. You want to turn her into a ghost before she's even born." Edward shrugged, returning to his laptop. "Don't be dramatic. It's just strategy." The cruelty grew starker with each passing week. The cherished pregnancy photos that once hung in their bedroom disappeared, replaced with lifeless landscapes. The baby shower Clara's ballet friends had planned was cancelled, the invitations torn apart. Edward dismissed it curtly. "We don't need theatrics." Though, in every public announcement to acquaintances, he spoke only of the Lancaster heir, never once mentioning gender. Clara felt as if her daughter was being erased from reality. As the due date drew closer, the pressure grew unbearable. Each time Clara dared to mention the baby girl, Edward silenced her with an icy stare. At parties, his friends Victoria, Charles, Beatrice raised their glasses freely to toast the future son, treating the lie as fact. One evening, Beatrice leaned close, her smile sharp as a knife. "Don't worry, darling. If it's not a boy this time, the next one will be. Edward won't stop until he gets the heir he deserves." Clara shivered, clutching her belly. In that instant, she realized these people did not see her daughter as a living soul, but as a disposable pawn on the Lancaster chessboard. In her despair, Clara turned to the only friend she still had, Sophia Ashford, once a fellow ballet dancer. Sophia arrived at the penthouse on a bitterly cold evening, just after one of Edward's parties ended. Inside, the laughter of Victoria and Charles still echoed. Clara pulled her friend onto the balcony, her voice trembling. "They're planning to erase her, Sophia. He's already prepared the legal papers. I don't know what to do." Sophia wrapped her in a firm embrace, whispering, "Clara, you can't stay here. You have to think of the baby. You must leave." "I?" Clara shook her head, broken. "He controls everything. The money, the accounts, even my old performance contracts are under his name. If I leave, I have nothing, and he'll use the law to steal her from me." Sophia looked deep into her eyes, her voice resolute. "Then you must be stronger. That child needs you. Don't let them decide her worth." Clara sobbed, collapsing against her friend's shoulder. In that moment, she felt utterly alone against the world, with only Sophia standing beside her. One June morning, nearly 9 months pregnant, Clara entered the room that was once the nursery. The sight nearly made her collapse. The beloved wooden crib was gone, replaced with a massive desk and shelves stacked with business files. Edward stood at the center, directing the workers. "Edward, what is this?" Clara cried, her voice breaking. He turned, his eyes void of emotion. "This room will be my auxiliary office. I need space to work." "But this is our baby's room. Where will our daughter sleep?" Edward met her gaze, speaking slowly, each word deliberate. "That is no longer my concern. I've already arranged a solution." Clara felt the ground crumble beneath her. You want to sell her? Hand her to strangers? Call it what you like," he replied smoothly, as if negotiating a contract. "The adoptive family in Switzerland is wealthy, reputable. She'll lack for nothing except her mother." "Allo." Clara clutched her belly, gasping, her heart splitting with pain. "You're a monster." Edward adjusted his tie, smiling faintly. "No, I'm a businessman, and a businessman does not let emotions ruin his legacy." Clara knew she was being cornered. No money, no power, no voice. Even her private doctor, who had once noted her anxiety and silent tears, had been bribed to sign off on mental instability. If Clara resisted, Edward could strip away her parental rights at any moment. That night, she sat alone in the darkened living room, hands cradling her belly, whispering to her unborn child, "Amelia, if I'm not strong enough, they'll take you from me. But I swear, I will do everything in my power to keep you with me. You will never be a mistake. You are the most beautiful gift I have." Outside, London's rain pattered against the glass, mingling with the desperate tears of a mother slowly being erased from her own family. A June night, the London sky thick with black clouds. Inside the silent Mayfair penthouse, Clara Moreau writhed on the bed, her body torn apart by sudden contractions. The pregnancy was only at week 36, almost a month before the due date, but Clara knew. Her daughter was coming early. "Edward!" she screamed, sweat pouring down her face. "The baby! She's coming!" From the living room, Edward Lancaster rose from his chair, adjusting the freshly pressed suit jacket on his shoulders. He did not rush to his wife's side, did not panic like any ordinary husband. He merely glanced at the gold watch on his wrist and sighed. "It's too soon. Probably just a false alarm," he said, voice cold. Clara cried out, "No, my water broke. You have to take me to the hospital now." Edward hesitated for a second. Then he turned, his eyes empty. "I have an important meeting at the Albion Club. I'll call an ambulance. But remember this, Clara, this child has nothing to do with me. She is not my daughter." With that, he put on his coat and left the penthouse, abandoning her desperate screams behind. 15 minutes later, The wail of sirens split the night. Clara was rushed to St. Victoria's Hospital, London's largest. The pain grew unbearable, blood soaking through the sheets. "She's losing too much blood," a nurse shouted. Nurse Margaret Doyle, stern-faced, yet eyes full of compassion, gripped Clara's trembling hand. "Listen to me, Clara. You have to hold on. Your daughter is coming." Through her haze, Clara clutched Margaret's hand and whispered, "Please, save my baby. Whatever happens, save her." The delivery room blazed with harsh light. Dr. Rajiv Patel barked orders. "Blood pressure's crashing. Prep a transfusion. We need to accelerate delivery." Clara screamed as each contraction ripped her apart, sweat and blood mingling on the sheets. Then, at the brink where life and death seemed to touch, a shrill cry pierced the room, strong, defiant, like a proclamation. "A baby girl," Dr. Patel declared. He lifted the tiny, crimson infant, slick with birth, yet robust and crying thunderously. Margaret placed the child in Clara's arms. Tears streamed down the mother's pale face as she kissed her daughter's forehead, whispering, "Amelia Grace, my child, you are perfect." But the joy lasted only a moment. "Doctor," Patel glanced at the monitors, his voice grave, "severe hemorrhaging. We need to get her into surgery now." Meanwhile, in the corridor, Edward Lancaster arrived at the hospital not out of concern, but for appearances. He could not allow the press to discover that Mrs. Lancaster had given birth without him present. When Margaret rushed out for family consent, Edward approached. "Mr. Lancaster, your wife has delivered a healthy baby girl. She's critical and needs immediate surgery. Please, come reassure her." Edward frowned. "A girl? Are you certain?" "Yes, a healthy girl," Margaret confirmed, baffled by his tone. Through the glass, Edward glimpsed Clara cradling the infant against her chest. For an instant, his gaze wavered, but then Victoria Harrow's words echoed in his mind. "A daughter is nothing but a burden. Pretend she never existed." He turned away, speaking softly but firmly. "I have no daughter. Whatever her mother wants, that's her concern. To me, she does not exist." Margaret froze, stunned, scarcely believing her ears. She watched him walk away, his polished shoes striking the floor like the hammer of a judge delivering a sentence. Inside the operating room, Clara drifted into unconsciousness. Before she slipped away, she whispered to Margaret, "If I don't survive, please, protect her. Don't let Edward take her." Margaret squeezed her hand, eyes brimming. "I promise. I'll protect Amelia." The surgery dragged on for hours. Dr. Patel and his team fought fiercely against death. At last, Clara was pulled back from the brink, though her body was frail and exhausted. She was moved into recovery, while Amelia slept peacefully in her newborn cot, her cries now softened into breaths of serenity. The next day, Edward did not return. Instead, his lawyer arrived, carrying a large envelope. Inside lay documents for transfer of custody, along with a contract for adoption by a wealthy Swiss family. Margaret slammed the envelope onto the table. "This is his own child. She needs a father, not a contract." The lawyer shrugged, reciting coldly, "Mr. Lancaster has made his decision. He has no daughter. My duty is to finalize the paperwork." Clara, barely awake but listening, forced herself upright and shouted, "No, Amelia is mine. I will never sign anything." The lawyer cast her a detached glance, retrieved the envelope, and left. Margaret rushed to Clara's side, wrapping her in a firm embrace. "Don't worry. I'll stand with you. Rest. Regain your strength. Your little girl needs her mother more than ever." Clara wept, clutching Amelia to her chest. Through her tears, a fierce light ignited in her eyes. During her recovery, Clara endured the harshest truth. Edward had vanished from their lives as if they never existed. No calls, no visits, not even flowers. To him, Clara and Amelia were nothing but traces to erase from the legacy. But to Clara, his abandonment became her vow. Lying in her hospital bed, holding her daughter close, she whispered, "Amelia, your father has left us, but I never will." I will fight with everything I have to protect you, to prove you deserve love." Outside the window, London's dawn broke, sunlight filtering weakly through grey clouds. And in that small hospital room, a love stronger than any legacy was born, the love between an abandoned mother and her rejected child. A week after giving birth, Clara Moreau sat in the discharge room of Street Victoria's hospital. Her body was still frail, her abdomen bound in bandages, her eyes sunken from sleepless nights. In her arms lay Amelia Grace, tiny, eyes closed, breathing softly. Looking at her daughter, Clara felt both pain and the strength to keep going. On the table sat a thick hospital bill like a mountain. The final figure made Clara shudder. £98,000, the cost of emergency surgery and neonatal intensive care. The finance officer, a stern, middle-aged woman, placed the file in front of her. "Your insurance was cancelled just before admission. According to records, your husband terminated all health coverage." Clara bit her lip until it bled. Could he be so cruel? Edward hadn't just abandoned her and their daughter, he had cut off every path to survival. "Please, let me pay in installments. I'll do anything as long as Amelia isn't affected," Clara begged, voice shaking. The officer sighed. "We can arrange a payment plan, but with no income, it will take you a lifetime." Clara hugged her baby tighter. "Then a lifetime it will be. But my daughter will not lose her mother." The sun fell. On the day of discharge, there was no luxury car, no waiting husband, no family embrace. Only Sophia Ashford, her old friend, who came in a rattling taxi. Seeing Clara emerge with Amelia, Sophia's voice broke. "My God, Clara, you've lost so much weight." Clara forced a smile. "But I'm alive, and so is she. That's the miracle." Sophia brought mother and child to her small Camden flat, just one bedroom and a living room that doubled as a kitchen. But compared to the cold Mayfair penthouse, this place was warm and full of humanity. Clara laid Amelia in a wooden crib Sophia had borrowed from a neighbor. Afternoon light bathed the baby's face in golden honey. Clara sank to her knees, tears spilling. "You don't mind if we stay a while, do you?" Sophia wrapped an arm around her shoulders. "Clara, this is your home too. We survived ballet school together, we'll survive this as well." But reality soon pressed down. To raise her child and pay off the hospital debt, Clara needed money more than ever. A week later, she began her first job, cleaning office buildings at night. Each evening, with Amelia asleep in a sling strapped to her chest, Clara quietly mopped floors, emptied bins, scrubbed desks. The hum of the vacuum echoed through dark hallways, the sharp smell of bleach clinging to her hair and skin. When Amelia cried from the cold, Clara soothed her with one hand while working with the other. At 3 a.m., she staggered back to Sophia's flat, hands trembling with exhaustion. Sophia often protested, "Clara, you just gave birth. You need rest. Let me take care of you both." But Clara shook her head. "I can't live off you forever. Amelia must see her mother strong. She deserves a better future." Her second job came when Amelia was 3 months old. Clara took work as a waitress at a 24-hour cafe near King's Cross. By day, Sophia watched the baby. By night, Clara served strangers. Some customers sneered at her tired eyes and clumsy hands. One whispered, "Look at her, the Mrs. Lancaster, waiting tables now." Clara heard but pretended not to. Each night, with only a handful of coins in tips, she thought of the hospital bill still lying in her drawer. The road ahead seemed endless. Yet every time she came home to Amelia's smile, strength returned to her. Her third job began when Amelia was 6 months old. Clara carried a mat to Regent's Park and started free ballet classes for children. Parents who could afford it offered small donations. The children giggled as they followed her movements, their eyes shining with wonder. One little girl clasped her hand and whispered, "You look like an angel." The words nearly brought Clara to tears. That night, though she carried home only a few pounds, her heart was full. Art, the very thing Edward had dismissed as useless, had become her salvation, the way she survived and raised her daughter. Time passed, and Amelia grew up surrounded by love, though life was harsh. On her first birthday, Clara bought a small cake from a modest bakery. Lighting a candle, she softly sang, "Happy birthday, my love." Amelia clapped her hands into the frosting, laughed gleefully, and babbled, "Mama." In that moment, Clara burst into tears, clutching her daughter tight. She needed no castle, no legacy, just that single word, "Mama," was victory enough. In the years that followed, life remained difficult, but steadier. Clara studied for a certificate in art therapy at night. She longed to help others who had endured loss, just as she and Amelia had. The tiny Camden flat became a home filled with memories. Drawings taped across the walls, old ballet shoes hanging from hooks, laughter of a child echoing through every corner. Though each month she still chipped away at the hospital debt, Clara did not falter. She knew every pound earned by her sweat proved to Amelia that a single mother could rebuild a life from ashes. One winter evening, Clara held Amelia close under a blanket, watching snow drift past the window. She whispered, "My daughter, we have nothing but each other, but I promise you will never feel unloved. You will grow strong and show the world that a girl can touch the sky." Loaf. Amelia, barely speaking yet, smiled and touched her mother's cheek with a tiny hand. Clara laughed through her tears. In that moment, she knew her life had turned a new page. No longer a celebrated dancer, no longer Mrs. Lancaster in a gilded palace. Now she was simply a single mother, yet stronger than ever. From the ashes, Clara and Amelia began to build a new world, small, poor, but brimming with love. 10 years later, the small Camden flat had become a home full of memories. The old walls were covered with drawings by Amelia Grace Moreau, the girl with bright eyes and a radiant smile. From the moment she could hold a crayon, Amelia loved sitting beside her mother, sketching innocent pictures, a smiling sun, her mother spinning in a ballet dress, herself with angel wings. Clara, now 34, was no longer a celebrated dancer, but she had become a trusted art therapist in her community. Her small office, housed in a community center, was lined with the artwork of children who had suffered violence, divorce, or abandonment. Clara taught them to use colors and shapes to speak their pain, and through that, to begin healing. Amelia often sat in the corner, doing homework or drawing more pictures. Other children admired her. "Amelia is amazing. She's always cheerful." And whenever someone cried from missing their parents, Amelia would quietly sit beside them and hand over crayons. "You can draw your feelings. I used to feel that way too." Many times Clara watched her daughter in silence, pride welling in her chest. She knew Amelia had inherited both her sensitivity and her resilience against life's hardships. At school, Amelia excelled. She loved science, especially biology and medicine. At 8 years old, she announced, "Mama, I want to be a heart doctor. I want to heal broken hearts." Clara hugged her, eyes brimming. "Don't you know, you heal mine every day already?" From then on, Amelia devoted herself to learning. She stayed up late with medical books, drew colorful diagrams of the human heart, even performed little experiments in the kitchen. When friends asked, "Why do you love the heart so much?" Amelia smiled. "Because the heart doesn't just pump blood. It carries memories of love and pain. If I can heal the heart, I can give hope back." One day, when Amelia was 10, her school held a Parents' Career Day. Each student had to introduce their father's or mother's profession. Children proudly declared, "My father is a famous lawyer. My mother is a bank director. My father is an aerospace engineer." When it was Amelia's turn, she stood tall, her voice full of pride. "My mother is an art therapist. She helps people with broken hearts find happiness again. She says art can heal even invisible wounds." The class erupted in applause. The teacher smiled. "That's wonderful, Amelia. Do you want to do what your mother does?" Amelia shook her head, her eyes shining. "I want to be a heart surgeon. I want to save people's hearts with both a scalpel and love." At the back of the classroom, Clara sat in silence, tears streaming. She knew her daughter was transforming her pain into strength for others. Though Amelia grew up without a father, she never felt ashamed. Once, at 7, she asked, "Mama, why don't I have a father like my friends?" Clara was silent for a moment, then told the truth. Because some people aren't strong enough to love and stay. But that doesn't mean you're worth less. It means you deserve twice as much love. No. Amelia thought for a moment, then smiled. Then let's love each other twice as much, Mama. From then on, she never asked again. Her mother's simple answer gave her the belief that love was not defined by the presence or absence of a man. Life for the two was not rich, but full of small joys. Each morning, Clara made toast while Amelia teased, "Mama, why are the eggs always burnt at the edges?" And they laughed together. Each evening, they sat by the window, drawing or reading. Clara read fairy tales, while Amelia commented, "The girls in these stories always wait for princes. But I'll be different. I'll save myself and others too." On weekends, they went to Regent's Park. Clara taught children ballet, while Amelia laid out mats and helped the younger ones balance. Neighbors adored them. Some even said, "Their home may lack a man, but it's stronger than many families with one." At 13, Clara finally opened her own art therapy studio after years of saving. The small sign read, "Moreau Art Therapy, where hearts find color again." On the opening day, Amelia ran around hanging balloons and pinning her drawings on the walls. She painted a special picture for her mother, two figures, one tall, one small, standing hand in hand on a pile of ashes, facing the Sunday. Above them, the words, "From the ashes, we create a rainbow." Clara embraced her daughter, tears falling. "Amelia, you understand everything." Though life was now more stable, Clara still carried a hidden fear. Each time Amelia spoke of her dream to become a doctor, Clara thought of Edward Lancaster. Where was he now? Would he ever try to reclaim the daughter he had abandoned? But then she reminded herself, Edward had chosen to leave. The power he once wielded meant nothing in their small world brimming with love. Amelia grew into a girl both intelligent and compassionate, proud, unbroken. She carried in her heart the truth of her rejection, yet never treated it as a stain. Instead, she turned it into fire, a force to prove that worth was not measured by gender, but by how one lived and loved. One evening, when Amelia was 15, she and her mother sat on their old sofa. Clara asked, "If one day your father came back, what would you do?" Amelia was silent for a while, then replied calmly, "I wouldn't need him. I already have everything I want here, with you, Mama. But I would still save him if he was sick because I want to be a doctor. I would heal his heart, then let silence speak for me." Clara stared at her daughter, struck speechless. In those 15-year-old eyes, she saw a pride and strength no force could extinguish. Amelia Grace Moreau, the child once dismissed as a mistake, was growing into a young woman not only resilient, but profoundly compassionate. A proud girl, certain of her worth, ready to step onto a path that would change her family's destiny forever. Time has its own way of collecting debts that were never paid. For Edward Lancaster, the debt was not just money or power. It was the debt of the heart, the ruthless decisions he once made when he treated love and people as commodities. 25 years after the night he abandoned his dying wife and newborn daughter, Edward was no longer the man the press once hailed as London's finance king. He was nothing but an old, lonely shadow hiding from the wreckage of himself. It hadn't collapsed in a single night. Like a rotting house slowly eaten away by storms, the Lancaster Empire crumbled brick by brick until the towering edifice became rubble. At first, Edward believed he still held control. He proudly thought that money and power could keep anyone loyal, that those who shared drinks with him at the Albion Club would always be allies. But the truth was, once blood was in the water, the wolves he had led were the first to devour him. The first knife in his back came from Charles Blackwell. For years, Edward had trusted him as his right hand, the only one who could share his ruthless schemes without judgment. Yet Charles was the very man who secretly drained Lancaster Group, dry funneling investments into shell companies, quietly amassing shares. By the time Edward realized, Charles had gathered enough power to flip the board. That fateful board meeting was held in the Lancaster Tower's top-floor conference room. Edward wore a grey suit, still clinging to his aura of authority, but inside he was a storm. He slammed his fist on the table, roaring that he was the founder, that no one could strip him of his throne. Charles merely smiled, lifting his glass as if at a dinner party, and spoke the words that would haunt Edward for years. "It's just business, Edward. You once told me emotions are a burden. Today, I'm only proving myself a good student." The board raised their hands one by one straight as spears nailing shut his fate. Edward was deposed as CEO, stripped of the empire he had built with his own hands. Before he could recover from that blow, Victoria Harrow struck next. The woman who once sat beside him, smirking at his speeches about the Lancaster legacy, now stood as his relentless prosecutor. With her political network and media influence, she dragged Lancaster Group into a storm of lawsuits, money laundering, tax fraud, breach of international contracts. Edward knocked on every law firm's door, desperate to hold back the tide, but the doors once open to him now slammed shut. Victoria never wielded the knife herself. She tightened the noose and let Edward choke on red tape and indictments. In a private meeting, her eyes gleamed like a blade as she told him, "You once said, to save the body, you must cut out the tumor. Well, Edward, you are the tumor of Lancaster Group. I'm only following your principle." Oh, her words cut as cleanly as surgery, leaving no escape. If Charles was the betrayer in the dark, and Victoria the executioner in law's name, then Beatrice Sterling painted Edward's disgrace for the public to see. With her vast media connections, she unleashed headlines. Edward Lancaster, the greedy king of London finance. Debauchery behind Mayfair doors. Lancaster Group on the brink of collapse. When, each day, a new scandal bled into the tabloids. Millions squandered on wine and women, shady shell, company dealings. Many were rumors, exaggerated half-truths, but the public didn't care about facts. They only craved the fall of a man once untouchable, a target for their pent-up envy and rage. Edward read those articles in fury, remembering the nights Beatrice had whispered beside him, "You are the king of London, Edward. No one can topple you." Now she stood on television, declaring coolly, "The Lancaster era has ended. It was inevitable when a man placed ambition above humanity." Blow after blow from those he once called friends. He realized he had built his castle on sand, on loyalty purchased with money. And when the tide of betrayal came, it swept everything away. Within 5 years, Edward lost it all. The Mayfair penthouse, where he had once ordered his daughter's ultrasound photos thrown into the fire, was seized by the bank. His suburban mansion was auctioned off, bidders laughing as they drove the price below market value just to savor his ruin. The art, the cars, the watches, all the trappings of grandeur vanished under the hammer of the auctioneer. On the day he left the penthouse, Edward stood alone in the hollow living room. Where a crystal chandelier once hung was now a ceiling scarred with hooks. Where Persian carpets had lain was bare, cold tile. He remembered Clara, trembling, holding the ultrasound and whispering, "Our daughter is wonderful." He had mocked her, rejected her, abandoned her. Now, the room echoed only with the footsteps of a broken man. Edward moved into a dingy flat in East London. 1 bedroom, shared kitchen, cracked walls, damp ceiling. The stench of mold and stale smoke clung to everything. At night, rats scurried in the walls, stealing his sleep. On a wobbly table sat a bottle of cheap whiskey from the corner shop, a pitiful substitute for the fine French vintages he once guzzled. His tailored Armani suits had long been sold. Now he wore a second-hand coat hanging loose, his wrist bare where a Rolex once gleamed. Each morning, he stared into a stained bathroom mirror, no longer the proud man of yesterday, but a withered old figure with thinning grey hair, sagging skin, hollow eyes. The reflection made him recoil. He barely recognized himself. Yet the collapse of wealth hurt less than the collapse of spirit. No one stood by him now. The men of the Albion Club either turned their backs or struck him down. His phone no longer rang with invitations. His inbox was no longer full of requests and deals, only unpaid bills, court summons, and the occasional anonymous letter sneering, "The king has fallen." He tried comebacks, small investments, but no one trusted him. His reputation was ash. Once, a young investor laughed in his face, "Mr. Lancaster, the world no longer trusts a man who called his own daughter a mistake. You taught us the most expensive lesson of all. Never trust someone who cannot love his own family. The words cut deeper than any headline. For years, Edward had buried the memory of Clara and Amelia. He had told himself his choices were for legacy, for duty. But now, with that legacy in ruins, he had no shield against the truth. He had abandoned his wife and daughter and lost everything because of it. Sometimes, in drunken nights, Edward dug through old newspapers. He stumbled upon articles about a young woman named Amelia Moreau, top of her class, full scholarship to medical school, later a promising cardiac surgeon at Street Victoria's hospital. His hands shook as he read every line, every photo. Her face bore Clara's features, her eyes fierce yet kind. She was the very daughter he had once called useless. Edward clutched the papers all night, heart writhing. He longed to run to the hospital, to tell her he regretted everything, to beg forgiveness. But fear consumed him. What if she rejected him? What if she looked at him as a stranger? That humiliation he could not face. So he quietly cut out the articles, tucked them into a worn folder, and hid it under his bed. It was his last treasure, the proof that his daughter had become extraordinary without him. But clippings could not warm the present. In reality, Edward had only £127 left in his account, living on welfare and odd jobs. He drifted like a ghost through the poor streets, unrecognized as the man who once ruled London's markets. Some days he couldn't afford his blood pressure medication, chest tightening, breath ragged. Death crept closer, and his only wish was to see his daughter once, just once. And fate, as if to complete the circle, granted him that chance. One rainy afternoon, on his way back to the crumbling flat, Edward collapsed on the street. A heart attack struck like fate's own hand, crushing his chest. Strangers called for an ambulance. Through the haze, he heard sirens wailing, saw blue and red lights flashing, and when the ambulance stopped, he glimpsed the sign glowing above the gates. Street Victoria's hospital, the very place where, 25 years earlier, he had abandoned his wife and newborn. The wheel had turned. The Lancaster empire had fallen not by market crashes, but by the cruelty he sowed. Now, lying on a stretcher, Edward Lancaster was no longer London's king of finance. He was only a sick, broken old man, delivered into the hospital where his daughter worked. And destiny was preparing a meeting he could no longer escape. The London sky that afternoon sagged heavy with grey clouds. The wail of an ambulance siren sliced through the rain like a blade, tearing the air. Inside, Edward Lancaster lay on a stretcher, face ashen, drenched in sweat, trembling hands clutching a thin blanket. His heart pounded wildly, like a panicked horse on the verge of collapse. A young paramedic pressed the oxygen mask against his face, speaking urgently. "You're having a major heart attack. We have to get you to the hospital immediately. Breathe steadily. Don't fight it." Through the fog of pain, Edward glimpsed the flashing red-blue lights reflected in the glass, until the ambulance stopped and a glowing sign appeared. Street Victoria's hospital. His blood turned cold. This was the very place, 25 years ago, where he had abandoned Clara in agony and turned his back on his newborn daughter. He had sworn never to return, but fate had dragged him back to close the cruel circle. Professional hands rushed his stretcher down the white corridors. The sharp stench of antiseptic filled his lungs. For a moment, he thought he saw Clara's face in the haze, pale, drenched in sweat, crying out, "Save my baby." He shuddered, eyes wide, but all around him were only strangers in scrubs. "His blood pressure is crashing. Prep cardiac emergency," a doctor's voice barked. Among the staff, Nurse Margaret Doyle, now head nurse, stepped forward. She froze when she recognized the old man on the stretcher. The years had aged him, but the face was the same man she had once seen walk away, leaving a wife near death and a newborn child. Her hand clenched around the clipboard. "Oh God," she whispered. Edward Lancaster, a young doctor, turned to her. "You know this patient?" Margaret nodded, her eyes locked on him. "I know him too well. This is the man who abandoned his wife and child in this very hospital, and that baby girl is now one of our best heart surgeons." The room fell into stunned silence. Eyes turned toward the assignment board, where one name stood out: Dr. Amelia Grace Moreau, cardiac surgery. On the 7th floor, Amelia sat in her office, jotting notes after a morning operation. At 25, she was already the youngest cardiac surgeon at Street. Victoria's, known for her deft hands and rare composure. Her brown hair was tied neatly back, her face lit with focus and quiet determination. The door opened. Dr. Henry Whitmore, head of cardiology, stepped in, stern as always, yet his eyes carried hesitation. "Amelia," he said slowly, "we have an emergency. Male patient, 59, severe myocardial infarction. He needs immediate surgery. I want you to lead this case." Amelia rose at once, eyes sharp. "Yes, Professor. Do we have the patient's file?" Whitmore handed her the folder, but paused. "Perhaps you should read the name yourself." Amelia frowned, opened it. One name leapt out in bold: Edward Lancaster. For an instant, time froze. Her ears rang, her hands trembled. A name she had never spoken, yet one that haunted her mother's silences. The whispered stories of abandonment, the quiet tears in the night. Her voice cracked. He's my father?" Whitmore placed a steady hand on her shoulder. "Yes, I confirmed it. You don't have to take this case. I can assign someone else." Amelia closed her eyes, Clara's face flashing in her mind, tear-streaked yet unyielding. Her mother had never spoken ill of Edward, only said, "Some people are not strong enough to love and stay. That does not make you less worthy." Amelia opened her eyes, voice firm. "No, I'll perform the surgery. He is my patient, nothing more." The operating room blazed with white light. Monitors beeped frantically, alarms shrilled. Edward Lancaster lay unconscious, chest split open, his failing heart trembling inside. At the center stood Amelia, gloved hands steady, scalpel gleaming. Around her, the team waited for her command. "Begin incision," she ordered, her tone calm, almost cold. Her movements were precise, swift, unwavering. Each cut clean, each instruction sharp. The staff exchanged glances, silently awed by her composure in such a high-stakes case. For a fleeting moment, Edward stirred. Through the haze of anesthesia, his eyes cracked open. He saw the young surgeon above him, those eyes, so achingly familiar. Clara's eyes. In that instant, he understood. This was his daughter, the child he had rejected, the life he had thrown away. He tried to speak, to whisper, "Amelia," but the oxygen tube silenced him, his voice lost in the fog. Consciousness slipped away, surrendering his fate to her hands. Amelia's expression did not falter. She did not see a father, only a failing heart. Clamp the artery, severe damage, prepare artificial valve. Hours passed in tense focus. Every stitch, every suture was a vow. She did this not for him, but for her own principle to save lives. At last, the heart beat again, strong and steady. Relief rippled through the room. Amelia removed her gloves, voice steady. The surgery was successful. Transfer him to recovery. When Edward awoke, dim light glowed from the recovery ward ceiling. His throat was parched, his body aching, but he lived. He turned his head and saw her, the young doctor, his daughter writing notes with calm professionalism, her face unreadable. With effort, his voice rasped, "You, Amelia." But she did not look up. Instead, she turned to a nurse, her tone clinical. "Patient's blood pressure is stable. Continue monitoring every 2 hours. Administer analgesics as prescribed." "Oh." Edward's words died in his throat. He had hoped for a glance, a word, even reproach. But she saw him only as a patient, nothing more. And that silence was the heaviest judgment of all. Outside the ward, Margaret had called Clara to the hospital. Her footsteps were slow, her heart pounding 25 years since she last walked these halls, memories still bleeding. As she reached the room, Amelia stepped out, removing her mask. Her voice was steady, though her eyes shimmered. "He's conscious. I saved his life." Clara cupped her daughter's face, whispering, "My darling, you've just proven what the world must see. You are not a burden. You are the light." Mother and daughter embraced in the hospital corridor, while inside, Edward Lancaster lay staring at the ceiling, his eyes wide, his heart raw with the cruelest truth. His daughter had saved him, yet denied him as a father. The recovery room at St. Victoria's Hospital was so quiet that every steady beep of the heart monitor echoed like a verdict. Edward Lancaster lay on the bed, his body wrapped in bandages, breath labored but steadier after surgery. The cold white light reflected off his aged face, where deep lines told the story of pride and decay. He had escaped the scythe of death, but what tore him apart was not physical pain. It was the emptiness in the eyes of the one who had saved him. Amelia Grace Moreau, his daughter, the gifted cardiac surgeon, entered the room. Her white coat fluttered softly as she walked, her face calm, her eyes bright with professional focus. She carried a chart, never once meeting his gaze. "The patient is awake," she said quietly to the nurse, her tone even. "Vitals stable. Continue observation for another 24 hours. Edward tried to lift his hand, his voice hoarse, broken. "Amelia, my daughter." The words pierced his chest like needles. He hoped she would stop, look at him, speak anything, even contempt. But Amelia never turned. She signed the chart, her voice clinical, detached. "Blood pressure 120/80. Heart stable post-valve replacement. No signs of infection. Continue treatment protocol." No glance. No response. Edward felt his chest constrict. He had once thought the cruelest punishment would be curses and condemnation. He was wrong. Silence was far heavier. The next day, he sent a bouquet of expensive white orchids with a card scrawled, "For Amelia, my pride, I am sorry for everything." When the flowers reached her office, Amelia glanced once and replied, "Send them to the oncology ward. They need them more than I do." The following day, Edward arranged to transfer his new car into her name, with the message, "I want you to have a better start." Amelia returned the documents immediately, saying only, "I don't accept gifts from patients." Boat. On the third day, he spent his last assets to establish a small foundation in her name, the Amelia Grace Foundation, hoping she would be moved. But when she read the letter, she quietly folded it, set it aside, and turned back to other surgical files. For her, her work, her patients, her principles, those were everything. The man in that bed was just another case, no more, no less. Edward's despair deepened. He wanted to scream that he had regretted every day for 25 years, that he had kept every article about her, cut and stored in a battered folder under his bed, read again and again like treasure. He wanted to say he had searched for her, that every letter he had sent was returned, stamped, no forwarding address. But each time he tried to speak, Amelia left the room before his words could escape. One evening, after her shift, Amelia came to check his charts. Edward's tired eyes glowed with fragile hope. He whispered, "Just one word. Call me father once, so I know I still exist in your life." Amelia did not answer. She adjusted his IV line, noted the vitals, and walked away. The door closed softly, leaving Edward in darkness. For the first time in his life, he understood what it meant to be non-existent. The silence killed him piece by piece. Not with knives, not with insults, but with absolute indifference. To Amelia, he was not father. He was patient 314. At night, Edward lay awake, haunted by the moment 25 years ago when he had thrown the ultrasound into the fire. Back then, he told himself he was a victor, purging a mistake. Now, every beep of the heart monitor told the truth. The only mistake was him, the man who scorned love and deemed his daughter worthless. Amelia continued her daily rounds with flawless professionalism. She never met his eyes, never called his name, never revealed emotion. Her hands stitched the torn heart in his chest, but she kept her own heart untouched. Edward came to realize his daughter could save his life with a scalpel, but he would never be reborn in her heart. That was his eternal punishment. One night, gazing at London's lights outside the hospital window, he whispered through tears, "Amelia, you've won. Not because you saved me, but because your silence is stronger than any blade." His head sank into the pillow, his tears soaking the white fabric. The Lancaster empire was gone, but his daughter's silence buried him deeper than ruin ever could. Upstairs, in her office, Amelia sat alone, leafing through patient files. Her hand trembled briefly over the name Edward Lancaster, She did not hate, she did not forgive, she simply no longer wished to name him. For her, he had died 25 years ago on the day he walked out of this hospital and said, "I have no daughter." Now, though she had saved his life, silence was her final answer. Not cruelty, simply the only way to protect her own heart and her mother's. Sometimes, silence is the loudest voice of all. That autumn in London, golden leaves carpeted the streets around Street Victoria's hospital. In room 314, Edward Lancaster sat by the window, watching other patients stroll slowly through the hospital garden, supported by family members. He had no one, no friends, no family, only nurses and doctors fulfilling their duty. It had been 3 weeks since the fateful surgery. Edward recovered slowly, but though Amelia had stitched his heart back together with her gifted hands, the weight pressing on it was one she could never mend, the emptiness in his daughter's silence. Each time the door opened, he hoped she would step in and call him father. But no, she came only as a doctor, checked his vitals, signed the chart, and left. Edward understood. He had no place in Amelia's life. And that was the fairest judgment of all. At night, he opened the bedside drawer and pulled out an old folder he had hidden for years. Inside were hundreds of newspaper clippings about Amelia, photos of her receiving academic prizes, articles praising the young Moreau who won a full scholarship, reports of a surgeon saving lives in rare operations. He turned each page, trembling fingers stroking them as though they were treasures. In the margins, his own scrawled notes. "She looks like Clara. Eyes as determined as I once wished for in an heir. I lost everything, but I have this pride left." Once, Amelia caught Margaret carrying the folder out of his room for safekeeping. She froze when she saw each clipping neatly dated, annotated proof of a father watching silently from afar. But she only pressed her lips together, closed the file, and returned it untouched. No anger, no softening, just the truth. It was too late. On the day of discharge, Edward refused an ambulance. Leaning on his cane, he shuffled toward the hospital gates. Across the street, Clara and Amelia stood not to see him off, but to meet another patient. Yet his eyes found them, mother and daughter, side by side, one proud, one radiant. In that instant, Edward felt it. This was the real family, the one he had thrown away. He longed to run to them, to fall to his knees and beg forgiveness. But his frail legs betrayed him. He simply stood there, watching as the crowd carried them away, leaving him alone amid the roar of traffic. In the months that followed, Edward lived in his shabby flat on the city's edge. But he was no longer the same. He stopped drinking himself into stupor, stopped cursing fate. Instead, he quietly sought redemption in small ways. He sold the last of his luxuries and funded a tiny scholarship for children of single mothers. He volunteered at the community center, teaching the unemployed basic finance. He served soup at a church shelter. Nobody knew who he had once been. They only saw a quiet, diligent old man. In every act, he thought of Amelia. He did not expect her to know, nor to forgive. He only wanted to leave behind something meaningful, a fragment of a legacy different from the cold numbers he once worshipped. That winter, his health collapsed rapidly. Doctors told him he had only months left. He did not fear death, only the thought of dying unnoticed, as if he had never existed. In despair, he wrote one final letter. "Dearest Amelia, I know you may never read this, or if you do, you will not reply, but I must write. 25 years ago, I spoke the cruelest words of my life. I have no daughter. From that moment, I died in your heart. I spent the rest of my life realizing my folly. The legacy I fought to protect crumbled, friends betrayed me, power vanished. But you, the child I rejected, became proof that a daughter can be stronger, greater, worth more than anyone. You proved me wrong. I do not ask for forgiveness. I only want you to know that I watched over you with the time I had left. I am proud of you, more than of anything else, and I know your silence is the justice I deserve. If I can leave anything, let it be the small scholarship fund in your name to help other children rise. That is my final legacy. Farewell, Edward Lancaster, once your father, but long ago unworthy of that title." The letter was never sent. Edward folded it, placed it beside the old clippings, and one night slipped away quietly in his dingy flat. No one knew until a neighbor found him and called the authorities. A week later, Margaret came to Clara and Amelia with the folder and the letter. "He's gone," she said softly. "I thought you should know, whether you wish to or not." "Oh." Clara opened the folder, saw the yellowed clippings and shaky handwriting. Tears ran down her cheeks, not forgiveness, but the grief of someone who had once loved, once suffered, and now saw that the other had finally realized his wrongs too late. Amelia read the letter, her face calm. When she folded it shut, she said quietly, "He chose silence from the beginning. Now silence is all I can return." Clara placed a hand on her shoulder. "You don't need to forgive, and you don't need to hate. You've lived rightly. That is your answer." Amelia nodded. In her heart there was no hatred left, only an emptiness she had long learned to fill with her mother's love and her work of saving lives. At Edward's simple funeral, only a handful of volunteers and community workers came. No lavish flowers, no grand eulogies, just a plain wooden coffin and a mound of earth. Clara and Amelia stood at a distance, not to bid farewell, but to witness the close of a chapter. Under the grey sky, Amelia squeezed her mother's hand and whispered, "Mama, we've won. Not because he's gone, but because we still live, still love, and never let his cruelty define us." Clara nodded, holding her close. In that moment, both knew they themselves were the true legacy, a living proof that love and resilience could rise from ashes, stronger than any empire built on stone and money. Amelia returned to the hospital, back to her work in heart surgery. Each operation, each life saved, was a declaration that her worth needed no one's approval, no family legacy to validate it. She was writing her own legacy with skilled hands, with a proud heart, with silence louder than words. And so the story closed. The man who once declared, "I have no daughter," died in solitude, leaving only regret. But the daughter he rejected, and the wife he abandoned, built a life full of light. That was the truest victory. No revenge, no hatred, only living well, living with dignity. And Amelia's silence echoed forever. "You were wrong. A daughter is never a mistake."